Hi, I'm Bob Orr. Welcome to another edition of Flashpoints on Washington Unplugged with Juan Zarate, our national security analyst. Juan, the primary flashpoint in the world, obviously, is Libya, and every day we hear stories about pro-Qaddafi forces trying to hang on and the protesters and the rebels trying to take new ground. Are we reaching the point here of civil war?
I think that's where we are, Bob. You see really a fight to the finish here between the regime and Qaddafi, who is acting a bit like a cornered badger, trying to retake territory, trying to shore up military and tribal allegiances. And then the opposition forces, which have started to look like and have started to be called rebel forces, arming themselves, starting to train soldiers and trying to not only defend territory like Benghazi, but trying to then take some territory, head toward Tripoli. And so this looks very different from what we saw in Egypt, obviously, very different from Tripoli. What you have is a bloody stalemate that starts to look like civil war. With then the question, what should the West do? What should the international community do? You've already seen the U.S. and the international community impose sanctions. The U.S. got very good and lucky in terms of the $30 billion that were frozen. Part of that is the Libyan Sovereign Wealth Fund. And so that noose is tightening a bit, but is it enough to actually force Qaddafi from power, especially when he's fighting for survival? I don't think so. And that's why we've had the debate about use of military force.
Secretary Gates at the Pentagon has been very careful to warn that if we impose something like no-fly zones, that's a huge commitment. He said that can only happen if we're kind of all in.
Yeah.
So what is the real option on the table here for the administration?
Well, I think it's difficult because I think Secretary Gates and Chairman Mullen have been sounding the warning bells about appearing too eager to inject U.S. military force or presence in any way, even what appears to be a passive no-fly zone. Secretary Gates reminded us yesterday that involves attacking Libya. You have to attack their air defenses. You have to maintain a presence in the airspace, and you have to be willing to use force. And this comes right on the heels where Secretary Gates has said clearly in the future we're going to have to be very careful and cautious about injecting U.S. forces and resources into the Middle East. He said anyone who ordered that would have to have their head checked. And so we're having that very debate in a smaller scale right now in terms of Libya. So I think we're having some trouble here because if Qaddafi is able to hold on to power, and as I've said, if he gets back some momentum, able to sort of consolidate power where he looks like he's going to stay, that presents a real problem because there aren't going to be levers to push him out other than military levers.
It seems, though, just waiting for Qaddafi to change his mind and leave seems like wishful thinking. I mean, he's really apparently digging in here. At least it looks like it.
I think that's right. I think, just recall Ronald Reagan calling him the mad dog of the Middle East. I mean, this is a wily, ruthless leader who has survived for 41 years in power. And at the start of this, I said in the early show, we were going to see more blood in the streets of Tripoli because this is a man who wasn't going to flee easily. And he wasn't going to believe that the forces of the popular movement coming from the East were actually legitimate. And we've seen that. Now he's portraying them as either drugged out youth or al-Qaeda inspired movements or something altogether foreign and nothing endogenous to the Libyan people, that he represents the Libyan people and he has to defend Libya. That's another reason why the administration, I think, will be loath to inject military force into the equation because it allows Qaddafi then to say, look, this is Western engineered, they're trying to take over the oil fields, and we need to unify. That could strengthen his hand.
Let's broaden this out a little bit. This all began, as people know, in Tunisia a few months ago when rebels there took to not rebels, but protesters took to the streets and forced the government to come down. Then we saw Egypt. Now we see Libya. We've seen trouble in Yemen and in Jordan. This is now, I think, fair to say, a revolution, isn't it?
I think it's a popular revolution, the likes of which we haven't seen before, in part because it's so amorphous, it's so widespread, and it's never clear how it's going to manifest itself. I'm still amazed that we have started to see protests in Oman, which is often considered kind of the sleepy underbelly of the Arabian Gulf. A very moderate leader, very placid society, not a lot of the divisions that we saw, for example, in Bahrain between Sunni and Shia. And so even in Oman, you've had protests and calls for reform. And again, you've talked to experts, they're all surprised that it's emerged there. Then you've got the question of whether or not it emerges in Saudi Arabia, whether or not you have instability in the heart of the Arabian Gulf, especially with the Shiite population. And then finally, I think, how does this manifest in places where it hasn't appeared yet? Places like Syria, where there is tension, but the regime is very savvy, been very good in the past at repressing signs of popular protest. The history of this is quite brutal in Syria. The 1982 suppression of the revolution, resulted in over 30,000 killed. And finally, I think outside of the region, it's very interesting to watch how this is playing out in places like China, where the Chinese government's quite worried about this sort of serving as a demonstration effect and emerging as a popular movement, a Tiananmen Square 2 kind of model that they have to worry about. And we've seen that. We've seen, very interestingly, the popular movements calling for walking or strolling sort of protests, not to actually be vocal, not to do much, but to appear in the same areas and simply to stroll. And the Chinese government has reacted very forcefully. They've arrested human rights activists and some lawyers. They've shut down certain searches on the internet, like Jasmine Revolution, you can't search. And they've flooded those areas with plainclothes policemen and uniform folks. And it's been quite dramatic. And I think we need to watch it because those strolling revolutions are called for every Sunday. And I think it's very hard for the regime to control. So the manifestations of this are going to change, and they're going to come in very different ways. And it's not just in the Middle East. We have to watch places like China, even North Korea, I think.
Very hard to judge history when you're in the middle of it because you don't have the proper perspective or context.
Right.
But I think it's not a stretch to say this really is changing the world in a very dramatic way.
I think absolutely. And I think one of the core changes here is that people have decided that they not only going to throw the shackles of authoritarian rule off their backs, but that they're no longer going to allow fear to dominate their existence. That people are willing to put their lives on the line, and that people are willing to go into peaceful movements to actually change their existence, and to change it in a way that actually is commensurate with U.S. values, democracy, human rights, the voice of the individual. How this all plays out, though, as we know, history of revolutions vary, but sometimes they're co-opted by the radicals. We saw that in Iran. We've seen it in other places. So we're going to have to watch how this plays out where the regime's already been toppled, like in Egypt and Tunisia.
Another hot spot in Africa, the Ivory Coast. We see some violence there. What's that about?
Well, we've talked about this before in Flashpoints, and we said we've got to watch this. In some ways, this is an interesting model for the international community because it's the same problem that's emerging in Libya. You've got a ruler of the country, President Gbagbo, who basically lost the election in November, but is unwilling to give up power. And he has members of the military, the police force, members of society who are on his side. The international community supports his challenger, Ouassante, who actually won the election and is being protected by the UN in his hotel in Abidjan. And so what you have are two camps within Ivory Coast marching toward a civil war. And you've seen an increase in violence. Gbagbo's forces have gone into some neighborhoods that support his rival. You've seen also increased tension with the UN peacekeepers and calls historically now from the West African countries for some type of intervention. South Africa and others have pulled back from that, but there's a real question as to how this ends. But I don't think it ends well, unfortunately. I think there's going to be further blood in the Ivory Coast.
This is different from the revolution we're seeing across northern Africa, but this is definitely a spot of instability.
Spot of instability driven by the election in November, which was supposed to really be the marker for stability in Ivory Coast, which has been amidst chaos over the last 8-9 years. They've had civil war, they've had strife. That's why the UN peacekeepers are there. And the election was supposed to solve the problem. Unfortunately, the president of the country doesn't want to accept the reality of the election, doesn't like the fact that the UN and others from the outside have given the victory to his opponent, and that has created the tension. And now you've got a potential civil war again in the Ivory Coast.
All right, and let's finally wrap up, Juan, with Hezbollah. People know that's a designated terrorist organization by the U.S., but I think they might not know it's also involved in drug trafficking.
Very interesting front in the financial war on Hezbollah that was opened up a couple weeks ago. Treasury designated a bank called the Lebanese Canadian Bank, called it a primary money laundering concern. And what the Treasury Department alleged was that this bank was a hub for Hezbollah money laundering and drug trafficking that involved not just the drug trade from South America through West Africa up into Europe, which we've talked about before, which Hezbollah has a hand in and helps control. But they're also involved in trade-based money laundering. That is to say, they're using the trade in goods, a variety of goods, to actually raise money, to hide it, to clean it, and to serve the purposes of Hezbollah, to include used car dealerships in the United States. This hasn't gotten much press, but it's a major set of allegations from the U.S. Treasury Department, and they've done it by trying to put pressure on a key bank that has served to launder hundreds of millions of dollars, according to the allegations, for Hezbollah. This hasn't gotten much press, but it's creating a lot of turmoil within Hezbollah quarters, a lot of turmoil in the Lebanese banking system, which wants to preserve its reputation and doesn't want to be tainted by this. And Hezbollah doesn't want to be tainted as a drug organization, but the reality is that's how they gain a lot of their money, from overseas. And we've seen the revelation of that now.
All right, we've covered a lot of territory today in a short bit of time. Juan, thanks as always.
Thank you, Bob.
We'll see you next time on Flashpoints.
Great.
All right.